Chapter 21. The Garden. Before there were walls, before there were gates, before there was a court to argue or armies to defend, there was the garden. It wasn't designed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't chosen. It appeared. When Danny was young, long before he understood fear, conflict, or the need to defend himself, there was already a place inside him where the noise quietened, a place where being alone didn't feel like abandonment, but like relief, where imagination softened the edges of reality instead of sharpening them. That place became the garden. At the time, everything else inside was empty, a wide internal wasteland, exposed, unprotected, vulnerable. The garden was the only thing growing there, and because it was the only place where Danny felt safe, the rest of the fortress was eventually built around it, not to dominate it, not to control it, but to protect it. This is the truth most people miss. The fortress did not come first. Power did not come first. Intelligence did not come first. Softness did. The garden exists because loneliness needed somewhere to go, because a child needed a place to sit with his thoughts without being overwhelmed by them, because imagination was the first coping mechanism, the first shelter. Everything else followed. This is why the garden feels different from every other place in the fortress. There are no thrones here, no verdicts, no war councils, no tests, no trials, only presence. The characters who live here are not loud. They are not dominant. They are not efficient. Many of them would not survive elsewhere unchanged. Here you find innocence, not as ignorance, but as the ability to experience without suspicion. Here lives wonder, still capable of curiosity without agenda. Here sits sadness, not spiraling, not performing, just resting. Here lingers melancholy, reflective rather than destructive. Here moves creativity, untamed, nonlinear, uninterested in justification. Here is imagination, expansive and unbounded, allowed to wander without being interrogated. These parts do not argue. They do not compete. They do not demand to be heard. They simply exist. This is why the volatile parts stay away. Rage cannot tolerate stillness. Panic finds the openness unbearable. Control has nothing to grip here. So by instinct, the system learned to keep the most fragile elements in the only place they could survive intact. The garden became a sanctuary. It is where Danny goes when the world becomes too much, not to escape reality, but to recalibrate. When anxiety shuts him down, when overwhelm presses too close, when everything else inside feels sharp and demanding, this is where he withdraws. And when he does, he is unreachable. Not because he doesn't care, but because the system is doing exactly what it was built to do, protecting the origin. This is also where learning happens differently, not structured, not forced. Knowledge drifts in here and settles naturally. Ideas cross-pollinate, perspectives shift without being challenged. Creativity is not summoned, it emerges. The garden doesn't produce output on command, it gestates. That's why inspiration comes from here, why new ways of seeing are born here, why even the broken parts can feel briefly whole here. Psychologically, this is critical. For a dragon Capricorn mind, hyper-aware, pattern-seeking, intense, structurally complex, without a place like this, everything would harden. Intelligence would become rigidity. Strength would become isolation. Awareness would become burden. The garden prevents that. It keeps the system human. It reminds the fortress why it was built in the first place. Not to conquer, not to dominate, but to preserve something fragile that mattered. And as the fortress expanded, as battlefields formed, courts assembled, towers rose, and beliefs found their place, the garden remained untouched at its core. Because if this place is lost, everything else becomes meaningless. This is where it all started. And from here, the mind doesn't move toward power or belief next, but toward something gentler, more expressive, and equally vital. Because imagination, once protected, does not stay still. It grows outward, and the next place it touches is where creation truly begins. The garden is not empty. It never was. It simply doesn't announce itself the way the rest of the fortress does. At its heart is Dan, not Danny. Dan, the name that existed before roles, before armor, before strategy, the name his mother used, the name that belongs to the part of him that never learned how to fight, because it was never meant to. Dan is the reason the garden exists. He sits on the swinging bench, legs not quite reaching the ground, watching birds land and leave. Sometimes he hums. Sometimes he just listens. He doesn't ask questions about the fortress. He doesn't wonder what the court is deciding or what the war council is planning. Those things were never his burden to carry. Everything else was built so he wouldn't have to. This was the first place, before the walls, before the towers, before the rules. When the external world became too loud, too confusing, too lonely, this was where Danny learned how to go somewhere without leaving. A place to be alone without being abandoned. A place where solitude didn't hurt. The fortress grew outward from here, not to dominate, but to protect. Near Dan, never crowding him, often sitting on the edge of paths or beside still water, is grief. Grief doesn't live here permanently, but it visits often, and it is never turned away. In the garden, grief isn't interrogated, challenged, or forced to explain itself. It doesn't need to justify why it's here. It's allowed to sit quietly, to look at memorials whose origins Danny doesn't always consciously remember, to exist without being rushed toward resolution. Because here, grief doesn't have to become anything else. Alongside it is melancholy, softer, reflective, almost companionable. Melancholy doesn't deepen pain, it gives it texture. It allows sadness to coexist with beauty, memory, and meaning. Moving through the garden, never stopping for long, is Daydream. Daydream wanders the paths freely, imagining futures that may never happen and pasts that never quite existed. It doesn't care whether ideas are practical or useful. Its role is to stretch the edges of possibility, to remind the system that not everything needs to serve a function. There is creativity here too, not in its sharp, productive form, but as something organic. It moves like wind through leaves. It appears in imagery, symbols, fragments of thought. Creativity here is not pressured to perform. It simply exists, waiting to be noticed. And then there is the bard. The bard belongs only to the garden. He doesn't answer to the court, the king, or the tower. He sits beneath trees or in the pavilion when the light is right, half present, half elsewhere. Music doesn't originate from him so much as pass through him, drawn from memory, emotion, silence, rhythm, things Danny has never consciously named. The bard doesn't explain. He sings. Later, Danny finds himself writing, revising lines, reshaping verses, never quite knowing where they came from, only that they were already there. You'll also find sadness here, not overwhelming, not drowning, just resting. In the garden, sadness isn't something to escape or fix. It's something that is allowed to breathe. There are presences that rarely speak at all. Quiet lives here, stillness, patience. They don't participate in discussions. They don't weigh options. They simply create conditions where nothing has to be urgent. And throughout the garden stand the trees, each one planted not as decoration, but as continuity. Some are for Danny's children, their growth mirrored in branches, seasons, strength. These trees don't argue or retreat. They grow regardless of what happens elsewhere in the fortress. Others represent phases of Danny himself, moments that took root and never fully left. They don't dominate the space. They coexist. Nothing here competes. Nothing here demands attention. This is why voices are soft, why movements are slow, why even silence feels full rather than empty. The garden is not a place of answers. It is a place of safekeeping. It holds the parts of Danny that must never be sharpened into weapons, categorized into arguments, or tested in battle. It allows vulnerability to remain vulnerability, not weakness. It allows imagination to exist without justification. It allows sadness to sit without becoming something it isn't. This is where the system remembers what it is protecting. And no matter how complex the fortress becomes, no matter how many chambers are added or conflicts resolved, the garden remains at the center, untouched, necessary, alive. Everything else exists around it, because without this place, there would have been no reason to build anything at all. The garden is not only a place to hide, it is also a place to play. There is laughter here, quiet, unforced, the kind that doesn't echo loudly enough to draw attention from the rest of the fortress. Dan laughs here. Sometimes he runs the paths. Sometimes he rocks back and forth on the swing, pushing just high enough to feel weightless for a second, just long enough to forget that anything outside the trees exists at all. This is enjoyment without audience, joy without performance. And that matters, because everything else in the fortress is purposeful, strategic, vigilant, measured. Even creativity elsewhere is shaped by outcome. The garden is the only place where things are allowed to exist because they feel good, because they soothe, because they remind. It is where imagined versions of memory live. Not memory as fact, that belongs elsewhere, but memory as story. Here, moments soften at the edges, painful details fade, meaning comes forward. It is not denial, it is preservation. The fairy tale lens that lets the mind remember why something mattered, not just how it ended. This is the inner mind of the inner mind, a place where memory is allowed to be kind. That's why everything in the fortress feels the garden, even if it never enters it. Every chamber knows this place exists. Every decision, every battle, every silence happens with a quiet awareness that this is what is being protected. And this is why the bard belongs here. The garden is a landscape of muses. The memorials are not decorations, they are anchors. When the bard sits near the memorial to Danny's mother, the songs that come are gentle, aching, full of reverence. Not grief alone, but gratitude. Love that survived loss. When he wanders beneath the trees planted for the children, the music changes. Lighter, hopeful, playful, threaded with wonder and fierce protectiveness. The bard doesn't choose these themes. The garden gives them to him. Every path is a melody waiting to be noticed. Every bench, every fountain, every statue carries a different emotional key. The garden doesn't demand creativity, it invites it. And because nothing here is urgent, inspiration arrives freely. This is why so much flows from this place. Stories, songs, images, ideas that don't yet have purpose but will one day become something essential elsewhere in the fortress. Without the garden, creativity would dry up, expression would become mechanical, emotion would have nowhere to soften. And worse, without the garden, everything else would collapse inward. Because this is where sadness can rest without becoming despair, where vulnerability can exist without being exploited, where imagination can wander without being interrogated, where joy can appear without explanation. It is not fragile, it is foundational. The garden holds the emotional weight of the entire system so that no single chamber has to carry it alone. It absorbs pressure, it diffuses intensity. It reminds the fortress that there is more than survival. This is why even the hardest parts of Danny protect it instinctively. They may never step inside, but they know what happens if it's lost. Because without this place, without play, imagination, softened memory, music, and muse, the fortress wouldn't just fail. It would forget why it exists at all. The garden is the place Danny goes when you see him soften. On the external, it's subtle, but unmistakable if you know him. You'll see it when he's around children, when he lowers himself to their level without thinking, when his voice changes, slows, warms, when patience appears effortlessly, not as discipline, but as instinct. You'll see it with animals, too, the way his hands move more carefully, the way his attention narrows into gentleness, the way the dragon steps back without being told. That's the garden. That's Dan. It's compassion without calculation, empathy without defense, joy that isn't loud or performative, but simple and present, a playful side that doesn't need to impress, only to connect. When that part of him is forward-facing, he isn't guarding anything. He isn't preparing. He's just there, and people feel it. But the garden doesn't only surface as warmth. Sometimes it surfaces as sadness, and that's harder to recognize because it's newer. If you know Danny well enough, you'll hear it first, in the tone of his voice, the pauses that weren't there before, the way his words land heavier than he intends. His eyes give it away too, not dramatic, not broken, just distant, as if he's listening to something you can't hear. That's the garden again. That's sadness stepping closer to the surface than it ever has before. For a long time, sadness lived almost entirely inside the garden. It sat on benches. It listened to the bard. It walked the paths and lingered by memorials. It influenced music. It shaped creativity. It colored ideas in dark, hauntingly beautiful ways, but it didn't speak outwardly. Up until now, Danny only truly knew two modes externally, joy and vitality, or anger and force. Sadness wasn't something he performed. It wasn't something he expressed. It wasn't even something he fully recognized as a state that could exist outside. It stayed in the garden. It lived in music, in imagery, in atmosphere, in the spaces between things. So when sadness begins to leak through now, when it shows in his eyes, his voice, his presence, it's unfamiliar territory. There's no strategy for it yet, no armor, no script. He doesn't do anything with it. He doesn't know how. He just lingers. He lingers in the garden longer than before. He listens to the bard more closely. He lets the muses take the lead. And without realizing it, that internal posture starts to shape the external one. That's why it feels different. It's not dramatic. It's not volatile. It's not destructive. It's quiet. And because it's quiet, it's honest. This is the part of Danny that hasn't learned how to protect sadness yet, because it was never meant to be protected. It was meant to be held, and the garden is the only place that ever did that properly. So when you see him gentle, when you see him playful, when you see him soft with children, animals, memories, music, that's him in the garden. And when you see him sad in a way that doesn't demand fixing, doesn't turn into anger, doesn't lash out, that's not weakness. That's the garden finally being allowed to exist out loud. The garden is not a place Danny opens to everyone. It's reserved. It's where he goes when he is alone, or when he is with people who have already passed through everything else first. The maze, the battlefield, the crimson court. Those who have been tested, reviewed, weighed. Those who no longer need to be assessed for threat or intent. They are inside now. Part of the fortress. They don't necessarily enter the garden themselves. Most never do. But Danny leaves the garden more often than he used to. Not physically, internally. He carries pieces of it with him when he's around those he trusts. Small fragments, a softer tone, a slower pace, a willingness to sit in silence without feeling it. He opens parts of that space to them, not by explaining it, but by being different in their presence. That is new, and it matters. Because for most of his life, the garden was sealed off completely, a protected internal sanctuary that existed solely to keep him safe, creative, and intact. It was never meant to be seen, only preserved. Now it's beginning to breathe. This becomes especially important when it comes to depression. From the outside, it can look like Danny has shut down, withdrawn, static, unmotivated, almost vegetative, like he's wallowing or doing nothing at all. That's not what's happening. Internally, the garden is active. When depression hits, Danny retreats, but not into emptiness. He retreats into sanctuary. The rest of the fortress keeps functioning. Systems run. Survival continues. The autopilot remains ready, waiting for the external world to demand action again. And while all of that holds, Danny stays in the garden. He listens. He sits. He lets sadness exist without needing to be solved. He allows creativity to hum quietly in the background, not producing, not performing, just existing. He lets grief walk the paths without being chased. He lets Dan stay where he feels safest. This isn't avoidance. It's regulation. It's how his mind prevents collapse. The garden absorbs what the rest of the system cannot process in real time. It holds emotional weight so the fortress doesn't fracture under it. And when the outside world becomes chaotic enough, when action is required, when something needs dealing with, the garden doesn't disappear. It simply steps back. The autopilot engages. The familiar mechanisms rise. The dragon moves again. Until then, the garden remains, quiet, contained, alive. Not a place of giving up, but a place of waiting safely until the moment comes when movement is possible again. This is where the why finally becomes clear. For a dragon Capricorn mind, everything has a function, and nothing is placed casually. The garden exists because none of the other places can hold this kind of material without damaging it. The library is for fact, record, structure, and recall. It dissects. It categorizes. It asks, what is this and where does it belong? The hill is for faith, meaning, symbol, and awe. It allows belief, but at a distance. The war rooms are for threat, response, dominance, survival. The tavern is for deflection, humor, social lubrication, release. The court is for judgment, synthesis, decision. The garden is for none of that. The garden exists for what cannot survive analysis, judgment, debate, or strategy. A dragon mind sees too much. A Capricorn mind organizes too much. Add schizophrenia, multiple perspectives alive at once, and you get a system that, if unchecked, would tear its own softest parts apart, trying to understand them. So the garden is where understanding is suspended, not erased, not denied forever, just paused. This is why the things that live here do not belong in the library, because once cataloged, they would lose their meaning. They don't belong on the hill because they are not belief, they are experience. They don't belong in the war rooms because they are not problems to solve. They don't belong in the tavern because humor would trivialize them. They don't belong fully in the court because judgment would force conclusions too early. They belong here because here they are allowed to exist without being processed. That is the key distinction. For a dragon Capricorn, this is not weakness. It's architectural genius. This is where denial lives, not as pathology, but as permission. This is where avoidance lives, not as failure, but as pacing. Things are allowed to be too much here. They are allowed to wait. They are allowed to remain unresolved without being erased or forced into action. That's why compassion lives here. That's why empathy originates here. That's why innocence survives here. That's why grief is tolerated instead of exiled. Because if these things were dragged into the court too early, they'd be argued down. If they were dragged into the war rooms, they'd be weaponized. If they were dragged into the library, they'd be sterilized. So they are kept somewhere safe from competence. And this is the part most people misunderstand. From the outside, this looks like escapism, like withdrawal, like avoidance, like denial. And in a way it is. But it's intentional denial, the kind that prevents overload, the kind that keeps the system from collapsing under its own awareness, the kind that ensures the dragon doesn't burn down the very thing it exists to protect. This garden is not about pretending things aren't happening. It's about choosing when they're allowed to matter. Because when compassion, empathy, softness, creativity, and vulnerability are protected here, they don't disappear. They inform the rest of the system later. They leak gently into the court. They temper the war rooms. They soften the edges of judgment. They remind the dragon what it is defending in the first place. That's why this place exists. And if you're paying attention now, this is where it becomes obvious just how complex, how deliberate, how remarkably functional this mind actually is. What looks like retreat is regulation. What looks like avoidance is containment. What looks like fragility is preservation. The garden is not an escape from reality. It's the reason reality can be returned to at all. And from here, everything flows outward differently. What happens in the garden does not come out as rage. It doesn't come out as argument. It doesn't come out as strategy, judgment, doctrine, or destiny. It comes out sideways. This is the place where things Danny cannot fight, cannot reason with, cannot intellectualize, and cannot spiritualize are finally allowed to move, not toward resolution, toward expression. Here, pain doesn't demand an answer. Longing doesn't demand fulfillment. Sadness doesn't demand fixing. They become sound. They become imagery. They become movement, rhythm, tone, instinct. This is where music is born, not as a decision, not as a skill, not as a plan, but as a translation, a way of turning what has no external language into something that can exist in the world without being explained. Danny doesn't understand the garden in words. He doesn't need to. The garden speaks through him. Externally, this is when you see it, when he creates without trying, when he expresses without defending, when he moves toward art, craft, building, problem solving, or care without being able to explain why it feels right. This is why his creativity doesn't just stay creative. It becomes strategy. It becomes business sense. It becomes instinctive leadership. It becomes patience with children, gentleness with animals, an ability to sit with people in pain without needing to dominate, correct, or rescue them. All of that is seated here. Because the garden doesn't teach what to do, it teaches how to feel without collapsing. For a dragon Capricorn, this is essential. Dragons are driven. Capricorn builds. The system is efficient, forceful, relentless. Without this place, everything would eventually become optimization, pressure, output. The garden prevents that. It reminds the system why effort exists at all, why protection matters, why power needs tenderness to remain human. This is where motivation quietly regenerates, where inspiration returns without being summoned, where meaning leaks back into the rest of the fortress without announcement. Danny doesn't leave the garden with answers. He leaves with movement. And that movement, subtle, untraceable, deeply personal, is what fuels everything else he does. The fortress may survive without this place, but without the garden, it would survive empty. This is where the soul breathes, not loudly, not heroically, but enough to keep everything alive. And above it all, the sun looks down on the garden and does what it has always done. It gives light, not judgment, not command, just warmth, just enough clarity for things to grow without being scorched. The sun keeps the garden alive by reminding it that life continues. But the moon watches too. The moon does not force growth, it permits it. It allows the trees to grow crooked if they must. It allows roots to spread where they need to. It allows night to exist without panic. And as has always been true, anyone who would ever stand beside Danny would have to accept this place. The children, the memories, the softness, not as baggage, but as life already in progress. And within the garden itself walks the lunar ghost. She doesn't come to analyze it. She doesn't come to fix it. She comes to see. She walks the paths quietly, reading what cannot be read. She understands that there are things a child's mind could never name and things an adult mind still cannot articulate. She knows that some truths don't survive language, but they survive expression. She hears them in the music. When the bard sings, that is Danny speaking without words, not explaining, not defending, just being heard. And she understands it, because it is her language too. The echo does not shout here. It doesn't command or warn. It responds. It mirrors the melody, hums it back, matches the rhythm. It turns expression into connection. What rises from the garden does not need translation. It resonates. This is how they communicate. Not through memory, not through narrative, but through vibration, tone, feeling. She doesn't need to know every detail of where he came from. She only needs to accept that he did come from somewhere, that the way he is was shaped long before he could choose it, that some roots were planted before he ever knew what soil was. And she does. That acceptance, quiet, complete, is what allows the garden to remain sacred. Because when these things are allowed to exist as music, as expression, as shared silence, they no longer need to be defended or justified. They simply are. And with that understanding held, not questioned, we move on. Down from the garden, away from the light and the open air, the paths narrow. We move toward the base of the tower, toward the places that were never meant to be seen, only contained, toward where what cannot grow is stored, where what cannot be spoken is kept, where the things that don't belong in sunlight are pushed out of sight and held together by stone and necessity. Not a place of nurture, not a place of expression, but a place of containment, the opposite of the garden, and yet just as essential. That is where we go next.